We found a tree stump still warm, as if something enormous had just been sitting on it. At first none of us said anything. We only stood there in the clearing, hands hanging loosely at our sides, breathing in the strange warmth that rose from the cut surface of the stump. It steamed faintly in the cold forest air. One of us pressed a palm to it and pulled back immediately. "Still warm," someone whispered. "Not sun warm. Not the fading warmth of afternoon heat trapped in wood. Body warm." The stump was wide enough that 3 of us could have sat on it shoulder to shoulder. The growth rings spiraled outward like a target. Sap had pooled along one edge, thick and amber, and the warmth radiating from the center felt deep, as though it came from the inside of the earth. Something had been here, something very large. The forest around us had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not the ordinary quiet of deep woods. We were used to that. We had spent days moving through these trees, cataloging streams, mapping the old logging roads swallowed by moss. Normally the forest whispered constantly. Wind in needles, insects ticking in bark, birds stitching the canopy with small bursts of sound. But here the quiet had weight. We realized, slowly, that we could hear each other breathing. The stump sat in the middle of a small clearing that shouldn't have existed. The trees surrounding it were old firs and hemlocks, their trunks thick enough that 2 people linking arms couldn't circle them. Yet the ground around the stump was bare. No saplings, no ferns, no fallen branches. Just flattened needles, pressed down in a wide circular pattern, as if something enormous had rested there for a long time. One of us circled the stump slowly. No tracks, and that was the first wrong thing. The soil around the clearing was damp and soft. Our boots had already left deep impressions. Yet whatever had warmed the stump had left nothing behind. No claw marks, no prints, no drag lines. Just the flattened forest floor. We began noticing other things then. The wind didn't cross the clearing. We could see the branches moving high above the trees, swaying slowly, but inside the circle the air remained perfectly still. And colder. Except for the stump. Someone laughed softly, the way people do when their nerves begin to tighten. Maybe a bear, but none of us believed it. A bear would have left sign everywhere. Broken brush, clawed bark, the heavy musk of animal fur. Instead the clearing smelled faintly sweet, like wet leaves and old sap, and something else, something mineral. We stayed longer than we meant to. That was the second wrong thing. Normally, when something feels off in the woods, you move on. Instinct pushes you forward. But here the feeling was different, not exactly fear. More like curiosity pressing inward from all sides. As if the clearing itself wanted us to remain. One of us knelt beside the stump again. "It's cooling," they said. And when we touched it again, the warmth had indeed faded slightly. Whatever had been here had only just left. The silence deepened. Then somewhere in the trees behind us, a branch bent. Not snapped, bent. A long, slow creaking sound. We all turned at once. Nothing moved. The forest stood perfectly still, a grid of dark trunks and shadowed undergrowth. Yet the sensation came over us then, quiet and undeniable. We were no longer alone. We left the clearing after that. Not quickly, not running, but with the careful pace people use when they know something may be watching them and they don't want to appear like prey. Our path followed an old animal trail threading downhill through moss and exposed roots. The deeper we walked, the more the forest began behaving strangely. At first it was the sounds. Bird calls returned, but wrong. Delayed. We would hear the flutter of wings first, then the chirp several seconds later, as though the forest's audio had slipped slightly out of alignment. Our footsteps echoed too long. Even the wind seemed to move unevenly through the trees, pausing and restarting like breath held and released. One of us noticed the temperature next. "Feel that?" We stepped through a patch of cold so sharp it made our teeth ache. 2 steps later the air warmed again, then cold again. The shifts came in irregular bands across the forest floor, invisible but unmistakable. Our breath fogged and cleared, like we were passing through the ribs of something enormous. That was when we began seeing the depressions. Not footprints. The ground ahead would sink slightly, as if something very heavy had pressed there, but the soil remained unbroken. Moss flattened, needles crushed, each depression wider than a car tire, and spaced too far apart for any animal. They continued ahead of us. Not behind. Ahead. As though something enormous moved through the forest just out of sight, always a short distance in front of our group. We tried to step off the trail. The moment we did, the forest thickened. Branches snagged our packs. Thorny vines we hadn't noticed before caught our sleeves. Fallen logs blocked the way. But the trail remained open, inviting, guiding us forward. We didn't say it aloud then, but the thought moved quietly through the group. We were being herded. Hours passed like that. The depressions continued appearing ahead of us, silent and patient. Sometimes the ground trembled faintly beneath our boots, a slow vibration that seemed to come from deep under the soil rather than from any surface movement. Once we heard something breathe. Not nearby, not far away either. Just a vast inhalation somewhere in the forest, as if the trees themselves had drawn air into a hidden lung. We stopped walking. The breath stopped too. The forest waited. Then the trail curved upward toward a ridge where the trees grew thinner. And there, in a small hollow just below the crest, we found another stump. This one larger, much larger. Its surface was blackened with age, the growth rings twisted into unnatural shapes. Lichen covered the edges like old scars. But the center was warm, warmer than the first. None of us touched it immediately, because the ground around this stump was not empty. The moss was depressed in enormous overlapping patterns, broad shallow impressions that spread outward like ripples in water. Except they did not lead away. They circled. We felt it before we understood it. The presence. Heavy. Patient. Something was sitting here again. Not physically. Not entirely. The warmth beneath our hands pulsed once. Very faint. And suddenly the forest sound shifted. Leaves stirred all around us though the wind had died. The temperature dropped sharply. One of us turned slowly toward the trees. "I think," they whispered. It never left. The realization came together piece by piece. The depressions ahead of us. The trail that refused to let us leave. The warmth moving from stump to stump. It hadn't been walking. It had been moving through the forest the way shadow moves across ground. Occupying places. Sitting. Waiting. And guiding us. Because the hollow around us had the shape of a bowl. And we stood at the bottom. We felt the weight of its attention then. Not from any direction. From everywhere at once. The warmth beneath the stump surged suddenly. So hot it forced our hands away. And in the moss beside us, a new depression slowly formed. Not from pressure. From absence. The ground sagged inward as though something enormous had lowered itself into a space that did not quite exist in the physical world. The air thickened. Our ears filled with a low sound, like distant wind through hollow trunks. Then someone in our group looked down, at the soil between our boots, and whispered something none of us will ever forget. "Those aren't old depressions." We followed their gaze. The patterns in the moss. The flattened arcs circling the stump. They weren't tracks. They were seats. Places where something vast had settled before. Many times. For a very long time. And then we noticed the final thing. Right behind us. Close enough that none of us understood how we had missed it before. The forest floor was slowly sinking. Forming a fresh, enormous impression. As though something had just sat down to watch us. The forest path ahead of us rearranged itself like a sliding puzzle. We saw it happen. At first we thought it was a trick of perspective, the way trails sometimes appear to shift when wind moves branches or when shadows slide across the ground. But this was slower, deliberate, mechanical in a way that made our stomachs tighten. The narrow dirt path split into 3 directions about 20 paces ahead. We had been walking toward the leftmost fork. We all remembered it clearly. The bent cedar leaning above it, the exposed roots crossing the soil like knuckles. Then the cedar moved. Not swaying. sliding. Its trunk drifted sideways through the undergrowth with a soft grinding sound, dragging a curtain of vines with it. At the same time, the right-hand trail widened and aligned itself directly in front of us. The left fork sealed itself behind a slow spill of moss and branches. None of us spoke. We stood watching the forest finish rearranging itself. Then everything became still again. The new trail waited. Someone behind us said quietly, "Did anyone else see that?" We all had. The silence that followed felt heavier than the canopy overhead. The forest around us was old, older than the maps suggested. The trees rose straight and enormous, their bark folded into deep vertical ridges that swallowed light. Moss hung in long veils from the higher branches. The ground smelled wet and mineral, like soil that had never fully dried. We had been hiking for most of the morning. According to our GPS, the ridge road should have been less than a kilometer away. But the signal had died 20 minutes earlier. The devices all showed the same thing now. A blank grid. One of us laughed softly. Probably just wind. But there had been no wind. And the cedar that moved now stood perfectly still, as if it had always grown in its new position. We walked forward. Not because we wanted to, because the other trails were gone. The moment we stepped onto the new path, the air changed. The forest grew noticeably colder, though sunlight still filtered weakly through the canopy. Our breath began to fog faintly with each exhale. We noticed the quiet next. The woods had been full of sound earlier, woodpeckers tapping distant trunks, insects buzzing in pockets of sunlight, the faint rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Now none of that remained. The silence wasn't natural. It felt curated. Our footsteps sounded too loud against the damp soil. After a few minutes, the trail curved sharply around a cluster of boulders. And there, carved deep into the stone, we saw the first mark. A square, perfectly cut, about the size of a window. Inside it, the rock surface was polished smooth, as though something had been repeatedly sliding across it for centuries. One of us ran their fingers along the edges. These aren't tool marks. The cuts were too precise, too clean. More squares appeared as we continued, some on tree trunks, some etched into exposed bedrock. A few hovering strangely in the pattern of fallen branches, where moss refused to grow inside their boundaries. The shapes formed a kind of grid, not obvious at first, but gradually we began to see the structure. Rows, columns, pieces, like segments of a board. The path shifted again an hour later. This time we heard it before we saw it. A deep wooden groan somewhere ahead, followed by the sound of soil sliding over soil. When we rounded the bend, the trail had rotated 90 degrees. A section of forest floor about 10 meters across had physically turned, bringing a completely different stretch of trail into alignment with us. Behind us, the path we had walked no longer connected. Instead, it ended abruptly at a wall of tangled roots and ferns. One of us tried to climb through. The branches bent inward immediately, forming a dense lattice that snagged clothing and skin. We backed away. The new path waited, guiding us deeper. That was when we began noticing the footprints. They appeared along the edges of the trail, impressed lightly into patches of damp soil. Not human, not animal either. Each one was a shallow oval depression, almost a meter long, with no toe marks, claws, or heel, just smooth impressions. They did not form a line. They appeared scattered along the grid of carved squares we had been passing, sometimes overlapping them, sometimes centered perfectly within them, as if something enormous had once occupied those spaces, and then moved. We kept walking, because the forest kept rearranging. Every time we stopped too long, something shifted. A fallen log would rotate slowly across the trail behind us. A cluster of saplings would slide together like closing fingers. Clearings we tried to backtrack toward quietly sealed themselves with walls of brush and crooked trunks. The geometry of the woods was changing, reconfiguring, testing patterns. We began to feel it watching, not from a specific place, but from the layout itself, from the way trails aligned when we stepped forward, from the way intersections formed only when we approached them. The forest wasn't trapping us. It was studying how we moved. We realized this late in the afternoon. Time had begun behaving strangely by then. Our watches insisted only 2 hours had passed since the first shift of the path. But the sun had already sunk low behind the treeline. The air grew colder with each rearrangement. We came to a clearing shaped like a perfect square. In its center stood a single stump, old, blackened with age. Carved into its surface was a grid of smaller squares, each one polished smooth. And across the clearing floor lay dozens of the strange oval footprints. Some fresh, some faded into moss, arranged like pieces scattered across a board. We stepped carefully into the clearing. The temperature dropped immediately. Cold pooled around our ankles. And then the forest moved again. This time the shift happened all around us. Trees slid along invisible tracks with a grinding whisper. Entire walls of vegetation rotated. The clearing expanded outward, revealing more squares carved into the surrounding trunks. The grid was enormous, far larger than we had realized, and we stood inside one small section of it. A game board. One of us turned slowly in place. "We're pieces." The words hung in the frozen air, because the footprints around us were not random. They formed patterns, paths, moves, and the ones nearest to us had appeared recently. Fresh depressions pressing into the moss. Watching the clearing's edge, we noticed something else. The trunks there were slightly indented. Not from age, from pressure, as though something vast leaned forward just beyond our sight. The temperature fell again. Our breath became visible clouds. Then the path on the far side of the clearing slid open. A new corridor between the trees, perfectly aligned with us. Waiting, we did not move. Behind us, another section of forest slowly rotated shut, blocking the way we had come. The silence deepened until we could hear our own heartbeats. And then, very gently, the grid beneath our boots shifted one square forward. Not the trees, the ground itself. Sliding, repositioning, as if something unseen had just made its next move. We realized then that the footprints in the clearing were not the forest's. They were ours. The board was still being played. And somewhere beyond the darkened treeline, something patient was deciding where we would step next.